Welcome to Good History, the podcast brought to you by the Oklahoma State University History Department and inspired by the esteemed historian and Oklahoma native Dr. John Hope Franklin's line that a good historian is a moralist at heart. We bring together people from diverse walks of life who research history, studied history, read history, and think about history. We want to know what history means to them, and we want to ask them a big question. If studying history doesn't necessarily make us feel good, how does knowing more of it make our lives better? Hello and welcome. I'm Brian Hosmer, professor and head of the OSU History Department, and your host for this episode. My guest is Hannibal Johnson. Hannibal Johnson is a Tulsa-based attorney, author, teacher, consultant, public figure, and historian. In addition to serving on various commissions and running his own business, Hannibal has authored no fewer than 11 books, generally about Black history. Most recently, 10 Ways You Can Advance Social Justice Without Destroying Each Other, which is particularly timely, not to mention germane to this podcast's underlying rationale. We'll get to that book in a couple of minutes, but first, welcome to Good History, Hannibal, and nice to see you again.
It's great to be here.
Allow me to begin by simply asking you to tell us a bit about yourself. You grew up in Arkansas in the 1960s and 70s. Tell us about that. What was your childhood and adolescence like in Fort Smith?
So I was actually born in Clarksville, Arkansas. I was born there because the town we lived in, Coal Hill, population maybe 500 or so, didn't have a hospital. So I was born in Clarksville, stayed there for about 3 years. We moved to Fort Smith, which I consider my hometown because I went to high school there and graduated from the Fort Smith Northside High School. But when I was about 5, we moved to a small town in Texas, west of Dallas, called Mineral Wells, population about 20,000. So I lived there until I was 13, and we moved back to Fort Smith. So I went to junior high school and high school in Fort Smith, graduated in 1977, the height of the disco era. Went on to the University of Arkansas at Fayetteville, had a double major in economics and sociology. I decided during my sophomore year, I believe it was, that I wanted to go to law school to enhance my options. I applied to, I believe, 5 law schools, including Harvard and Stanford. I got a fairly quick acceptance to Harvard, which my sister encouraged me to accept. Took her advice, which was wonderful advice, and had a great experience overall at Harvard. Ended up working in Tulsa for a law firm called Connor and Winters after my second year in law school. And after graduating, decided to come back to that law firm in part because I wanted to be in this part of the country near my hometown of Fort Smith. And the rest is history, as they say.
So when you came back to Tulsa, was the city new to you, or did you have some older connections to this place?
So Tulsa was really new to me. I knew almost nothing about Tulsa. Ironically, my father, who grew up in Ozark, Arkansas, in a rural community in Arkansas, spent 1 year in Tulsa. He had some relatives here in Tulsa. And because of the reputation of historic Booker T. Washington High School, he spent his senior year of high school living in Tulsa, graduated from Booker T. Washington High School in 1942. That was my only real connection to Tulsa.
But that's interesting. Yeah. So a little connection, not really coming back, but some kind of remote connection to it. So when you came to Tulsa and you're working with a law firm, what exactly were you doing?
I was doing mostly litigation at first. I ended up doing employee benefits law, which is a hybrid between tax and labor law, very much an in-office kind of practice. And it wasn't really gratifying. Simultaneously, though, I'd become involved in the community, in large part due to Leadership Tulsa, which is one of the oldest community leadership development programs in the country, founded in 1973. I ended up being president of the board later on and being on the national board and serving as president of the national board and so forth. But Leadership Tulsa really propelled me into the community and into nonprofit management and governance.
Oh, I see. Yeah. That's kind of an interesting trajectory and putting a number of things together. So where and how did you begin this shift toward what we might call history work in a broad sense, including researching and writing history, but perhaps not exclusively so?
The black newspaper here in Tulsa, the Oklahoma Eagle, which still exists, was even more prominent, I think, when I arrived in Tulsa in the mid 1980s. So I was asked by the black newspaper to write a regular guest editorial column for the paper, which I did. And at one point, I was assigned to do a series on the history of Tulsa's historic Greenwood district, which I knew relatively little about. Wasn't really familiar with the massacre, then called race riot. Wasn't really familiar with the entrepreneurial and economic history of the community. But really, doing that 4-part series got me sort of up to speed, and it really whetted my appetite for more. So I ended up writing my first book called Black Wall Street: From Riot to Renaissance in Tulsa's Historic Greenwood District, which came out in 1998. And ever since then, I've been specifically interested in that history, both in terms of the commercial nature of the black community and the historical racial trauma that was the massacre.
Oh, interesting. So I want to dig a little bit into your interest in history and thinking about it and kind of where it came from. I gather your father was active in the NAACP when you were younger. Was that one impulse, or what you're describing now, or is it just in this place and the unique history of Tulsa that drove it?
Both my parents are now deceased, but I feel in part that I'm living their legacy. My father at one point was a teacher in an all-black school in rural Arkansas. He had always been active in the civil rights movement. He was president of the NAACP in Mineral Wells, Texas. He was involved in NAACP in Fort Smith, Arkansas. My mother was active, but mostly active in the church. So from both of them, I got a dose of the importance of education, of history, of community service, of activism and advocacy. And I think that really shaped my desire to sort of get into the realm of history. Plus, my father, he always had copious books around the house. Mostly these were books about the Black experience and Black history. And interestingly, that was information that I wasn't getting in the regular curriculum.
Right.
That's no surprise to you,
Right.
I'm sure. So I always knew that there was a lot of information that was missing, and that I had the opportunity to share insight and perspective on that history that related mostly to marginalized communities like the Black community.
So what was it like when you're going to school and you're receiving this narrative, and then you're home and you're looking through your dad's books and seeing something else? How were you processing that? How did that come together for you? What did it feel like, maybe?
That is a really interesting question. I think part of the way I absorbed that sort of schism is understanding that in the context in which I went to the public schools, I was often the only or one of the only Black kids around. So I wasn't really expecting to have information about my experience be the dominant information. And I realized that I had to get that from some other source. And so fortunately, I had a father who was also interested in providing that information and had resources around. And another thing that's interesting about that is, had the history that I was exposed to as a high school student, for example, U.S. history in the junior year of high school in Fort Smith, Arkansas, at Fort Smith Northside High School, had that history included the history of marginalized people, African Americans, Native Americans, Hispanic Americans, other folk, it would have been much more interesting.
Of course.
My experience with history, certainly at the undergraduate level and at the primary secondary level, was only about the rote memorization of things that were offered to us as fact.
Right.
I have to really be careful about the language because the reality is a lot of the facts were not facts.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a constant, right? And even today, maybe not surprisingly, we're still working in that context, despite all the changes over the course of time. There's still this idea of facts and the kind of limited nature of what's real history and what's not history. And I often reflect on something that I think one of my graduate school professors said, and he described it as the tyranny of the first exposure or the first impression, that it's difficult to dislodge one's first exposure or first interpretation of an historical event that you probably received in, if not primary school, then in high school. I think that's a really interesting phenomenon. So it's quite aside from the material that you're absorbing, but there's this sort of larger milieu, right, about what you learn, and the first thing you learn, that must be the part that's true. And what is all this other stuff? What do I do with it?
And add to that what I might call retrogression. In Oklahoma, House Bill 1775. I mean, the idea behind House Bill 1775 really is to take back history. It's kind of a make America great again ancillary. The idea is that we don't need to deal with the hard parts of our history. History needs to be antiseptic. It needs to be celebratory. It needs to be exceptional, and that's it.
Right.
Unfortunately, that's not reality. And given the fact that the demographics of our country are changing rapidly, if we really want to leverage the energy and the power of everybody in this country, we have to do a better job of owning our past.
Amen. Indeed. And it's interesting as well, when we think about the sort of rote memorization versus a more complex view of history and think about it in terms of how young people interact with history, it's also the latter, the more complex story is also a heck of a lot more interesting, and the rote memorization is boring, right? And at least in large measure. So there's sort of that part of it as well.
Absolutely.
So let's talk a little bit about the history you work on and the things that you do. And your books aren't just about African-American history, but more specifically communities, individuals, events in Oklahoma. I'm curious, first of all, what you think is interesting about Oklahoma. And as a non-native Oklahoman, I think it's a very interesting place. So I'm starting from that point. And perhaps what's distinctive about African-American history or experiences in this state.
Oklahoma may be in some ways the most emblematic of any state in terms of the intersections in American history, because Oklahoma really is all about the intersections of European Americans, Native Americans, and African Americans. And a lot of those stories are not well known about those intersections. Some of them, some positive, some negative, some ongoing.
Right.
And that's what really makes the history so rich and compelling.
Yeah, I think that's right. I find that particularly intriguing about Oklahoma. It is this sort of unique mix. It truly is this crossroads in all kinds of different ways and different manner of thinking about what a crossroads even is, right? And how people mix. So Oklahoma's all-Black towns are central to Acres of Aspiration and No Place Like Home, among other things that you've done. And what do you want readers to know about those communities? What should today's Oklahomans take from those stories?
Thinking about the all-Black towns forces us to think about a time when racism really was the rule rather than the exception. And one of the reasons the towns were formed in the first place was they were sort of oases of opportunity, civic engagement, political participation, and so forth. Escapes from crucibles like Alabama, Mississippi, et cetera. That's sort of the background of the towns. The towns also illustrate one of the raging debates of the era, certainly in the Black community, between Booker T. Washington and Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, which was, should Black people be really engaging around the idea of economic empowerment or political engagement and participation? And those things are not mutually inconsistent, by the way. But that was a great debate. So the towns were an opportunity in the minds of some Black people to prove their industriousness, to prove their ability to self-govern. The idea being, if these havens were successful as proving grounds, then racism would, of course, abate. And that sounds really logical, but really unrealistic and impractical.
Right.
And it didn't abate. So in those towns, though, you began to see people who understood that, yes, economics were important. They were important because economic success also gives you political clout. And so there's a direct relationships between economic and the political.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, and we can even extend it to contemporary events around Native nations here, and that economic strength has in fact translated to political potency in all kinds of different ways, and the reactions to it. But there's sort of that interesting kind of mix. So when you talk about your writing is on all Black towns, how are these books and stories received, and maybe received diversely?
They generally are quite well received because, and it might be surprising or ironic, there is a thirst for solid information about interesting aspects of our past. This is an interesting aspect of our past.
Right.
And it's not just Black people that are interested in Black history. All people are interested in Black history because Black history is American history.
Of course.
So I often say, you can't say you know American history if you don't include Black history as part of the mix.
Right.
So it's really important that we understand the various strands that contribute to the tapestry that is America, right? If we really want to understand our past and leverage that past in the present for the sake of the future, then we have to confront all of history. And the Black towns are just sort of one aspect of that.
So staying with that idea and just building off of some of what you just said, do audiences or people who respond to these stories make explicit or implicit linkages between those stories rooted to a degree in the past and contemporary circumstances, maybe even sort of strategies for moving forward?
Yes. And I think the best example is the most direct example is the Black community in Tulsa, which in some ways was like an all-Black town, although it's part of the city of Tulsa, the Greenwood District, Black Wall Street. So I often talk about the Black Wall Street mindset, and that is we have historical role models for Black commerce and entrepreneurship that we are beginning to elevate. And if we leverage the lessons from those historical role models, there's no limit to what can be accomplished in the present, because we understand that those people faced incredible racial barriers that we won't face. Those people were constricted to a narrow geographic area. We are not. Because of technology, we have a whole globe that we can interface with in terms of our commerce and entrepreneurship. So just understanding, particularly for Black kids, understanding that the things that you want to do have been done before and in circumstances far more dire than you'll ever face.
Yeah.
Not to say that elements of systemic racism don't exist today, just to acknowledge that they don't exist in the same ways that they existed in the past. And the sort of physical constrictions that people face then don't exist now. So if you understand that you can be whatever it is you desire to be based on historical models from 100 years ago, and understand that you have the technical equipment, technology to allow you to get your goods or your message or whatever it is you're marketing out there, then that really is compelling, I think, for a lot of young folks.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's interesting to listen to you as well, and that these concepts of business, commerce, entrepreneurship are sort of interwoven in the books, but also in the response. And I find that really striking and interesting. And as an historian, I'm reminded about what you just said about Booker T. Washington and Du Bois, right? And sort of this question of political engagement or political participation or political potency and kind of economic, right, uplift. And there it is, right? And seems like it's interwoven in that conversation around those studies.
Absolutely.
So this question about sort of past and doing history work and sort of contemporary situations kind of drives this next question. And, as Dr. John Hope Franklin observed, studying history is a moral enterprise, right? He really wanted to think of it that way, where we engage with the past, of course, through our current circumstances, which all historians do, to discover what some might describe as a usable past, right? This is a concept that we're familiar with. Your book, Apartheid in Indian Country, causes me to reflect on this notion of a usable past, but also how history can be uncomfortable, even threatening. So if we think about apartheid in Indian country and kind of the milieu around that, how do you reflect on that idea in the context of that book and its message?
History is hard. And one of the lessons from apartheid in Indian country is that, to use the adage, hurt people hurt people. So it really is a lot about how people who are not of the dominant culture are not immune to the dominant culture's philosophy, which was racism, and using that philosophy to oppress other people. Mm-hmm. And this is in the context of the so-called 5 civilized tribes who embrace the construct of African chattel slavery, who sided with the Confederacy during the Civil War, who after the Civil War executed treaties with the federal government whereby, with one exception, they elected to embrace their freed, enslaved people as tribal members, mm-hmm. but subsequently, in recent years, reneged on the treaty promise of citizenship. And that's being litigated in the Muskogee Creek Nation. It's been litigated in the Cherokee Nation. Mm-hmm. Successfully. The Cherokees, I really elevate the Cherokee Nation as a model for how we can resolve these recent grievances around citizenship. Cherokees have actually done a really good job since the federal court decision mm-hmm. of embracing their so-called freedmen, people who are descendants of the enslaved Africans who were among the tribe.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And a couple kind of follow-ups there. One is that story that you're describing has us really think deeply about this notion of kind of progressive improvement and change in history, or thinking about it in a linear fashion, right? So this is a story that moves in more than one direction, right? And as you've described. So there's that, and maybe we can reflect on that. And there's also the logic, if you will, of Jim Crow, which, would you argue, right, forced choices and forced indigenous people into sort of a box. The ultimate logic of Jim Crow is that there are 2 categories, not 3, not 4, not 5, right? 2.
Right.
Yeah. So maybe you can reflect a little bit on those, if you would.
Yeah. So this is the power of the sort of racist ideology. Yeah, there are 2 races, black and white. The rule of hypodescent.
Yeah.
I have relatives who could pass for white if they chose, but under the rule of hypodescent, they're black because they have some black ancestry.
Right.
And there, as you well know, for decades there were people who did pass for white because it gave them advantage. But it also diminished and demeaned them.
Exactly.
in horrible ways. So, yeah, I think Native Americans were part of this overall system of advantage and disadvantage. They bought in some ways. The 5 civilized tribes, the civilized really comes from embracing sort of Western ways, and the whole construct of slavery was part of the Western ways, right? So I think the tribes fell prey to the system.
Yeah.
And
the rewards and sanctions that were part of it, and as you say, also in participating, diminished their own communities,
right.
and selves.
But there's always an opportunity to do better.
Yeah.
And that's what I say about that's why I want to elevate the Cherokee Nation.
Yeah.
You know better, you do better.
Yeah. Agreed. I think that's a great point. Again, this follows this concept of crafting a usable past, right? What is it that we do with this history? And I think you've just described it really, really eloquently. You've written extensively on the Tulsa Race Massacre, most recently Black Wall Street at 100, as well as your first book. And its legacy, you served on the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre Centennial Commission and the 400 Years of African American History Commission, all very impactful work, I would argue. I'd like you, if you could, to walk us through both the writings and the broader public engagement and political work and sort of think about what drew you to this, what that experience was like for you, and sort of think about that.
Well, Senator Kevin Matthews, Oklahoma State Senator Kevin Matthews, in 2015 approached me about what was going to be done in the community to commemorate the centennial of the massacre. And so he's the one who created the Centennial Commission. And I think he had incredible foresight in creating sort of informal body that consisted of elected political officials, community members, educators, et cetera. And the idea was to build consensus around some things that we could do to mark the anniversary and elevate the community simultaneously. Mm-hmm. So we operated on two tracks. One was educational, and the jewel in the crown there is Greenwood Rising, the museum that we built. Mm-hmm. And the other is on the economic side. The idea was that the museum itself would be kind of an economic driver because it would bring tourists into the community who could then patronize the few businesses that exist, and it might create demand for additional businesses in Greenwood. We also offered some grants to small businesses and for individuals who had concepts about economic development. We did all those things, which I think in the end panned out quite well. Mm-hmm. We have tourists coming to Greenwood Rising literally from all over the world.
Yeah.
So we've had incredibly positive feedback. So that in turn has drawn a lot of attention to the community and the history. There have been a number of documentaries, as you might be aware, on this history. We've had opportunities really to elevate the community through that additional exposure. Tulsa Public Schools has been a fantastic partner in terms of infusing this history into the curriculum grades K through 12. We, in the run-up to the Centennial at least, we had a good working relationship with the Oklahoma State Department of Education. I'll leave that there.
Leave right.
So a lot of good things have happened, and there's an opportunity for more good things to happen, and they are in fact happening. As we discussed earlier, I think it's important that we acknowledge the good work that has been done, even as we insist that there's a long way to go.
Right.
Because if we want to expand the circle, if we want to bring in people who feel uneasy for whatever reason about this past and this history, we've got to let them know that we appreciate what's been done working together in the past and give them kind of a smorgasbord of opportunities to move us forward into the future.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. And in that enterprise and a lot of enterprise, again, speaks to the power of a usable past and history and things like that. So the race massacre has become, in a way, a bit of a cottage industry for writing and portrayal. I'm thinking about The Watchmen and thinking about a series of history books and things that are historically oriented or historically based. What's your assessment from this point in time and 3 years after your work on the Race Massacre Commission? What's your assessment of the kind of emerging historical or popular discourse around the race massacre? Where is it? What's interesting? What's not interesting?
Yeah, so I think for a while there was some, if not quite a bit of ambivalence to that. I like the phrase cottage industry because the sort of moniker Black Wall Street is popping up all over the place um, with regard to individuals and institutions that have really little to do with this community. But increasingly, I would say I'm kind of okay with that to the extent that encourages people or spurs people to be interested in the actual history, then I think it's a good thing. Watchmen is a great example. So Watchmen really moved a lot of folks to become really interested in the history, to do more research, to read books, to visit the community, and so forth. That's a good thing, I think,
Right.
Overall, in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah. Sorry, did I?
No, go ahead.
Yeah. So I think that's a great appraisal of this. In fact, I can say that Watchmen was the introduction to maybe even Tulsa for many people that I know back where I'm from on the East Coast, and they saw this and wanted to talk with me. Well, I just saw this thing. What do you make of it? It raises another question though, which is maybe important, maybe not, but is often there. And so this is a question of kind of owning or ownership of history. There's a phenomenon when we have contested events and then they emerge into greater public consciousness and there's more attention. There's this second question that emerges. Whose history is this? Who tells this story, right? Are there, right, frameworks or rules or things that need to be in that mix? And that's a hard question, but I'm curious how you think about that.
I think it only becomes a hard question when there aren't a multiplicity of voices, right? So I think about, if we look at television in the 60s and 70s when I was growing up, there was an absence of people of color on television. And then when there were shows, even within those communities, there were critiques of those shows. And the critiques, I think, stemmed apart from the fact that there weren't more shows for a variety of different perspectives and subject matter areas. I think the same is true of something like Tulsa history. So I'm actually friends with Dr. Scott Ellsworth, who's a professor at University of Michigan. And I've heard people, not a whole lot of people, but some people sort of offer the critique that, well, Scott's a white man, and what does he know about this history? And so, well, Scott's a historian. So he comes from a place of discipline around knowing factual information, and he's also a good writer, so he's able to tell it. But the way I share the information is going to be different from the way Scott shares the information. There's a place for Scott and there's a place for me.
I think that's a great point. Yeah, and when we think about, the discipline of history in the sort of current context, that there are conventions and rules that historians follow for acquiring, evaluating, presenting information, right? And there is that sort of place there. Tulsa Race Massacre work also revolves around questions of reconciliation. What does reconciliation mean in this context that we've just been exploring? Who is reconciling and with whom?
I think I would say that we as a community are reconciling with our shared past. And for me, reconciliation has to do with really a sort of alliterative three-part process: acknowledgement, apology, and atonement. So we have to acknowledge the reality of our history. We have to, where appropriate, make apology for things that were done that shouldn't have been done in the past. And part of the apology process for me is developing a sense of empathy for the people who were victimized by the harms of the past. And then atonement, we typically talk about reparations. I like the word atonement only because reparations, that word has been sort of co-opted to mean cash payments to living individuals, which is an incredibly narrow definition of the word. Atonement, when I talk about atonement, I mean, what is it that we do to make amends or to repair the past to the extent that reparation is possible? and we're not going to be able to do it perfectly. But there's a listing of things that we could possibly do to make it better for all of us. And so what's on that list? Cash payments to certain people might be on the list, but certainly not the only thing that's on the list.
That's interesting. And so when you were working on the Race Massacre Commission, I imagine you had a lot of conversations about reconciliation and what it meant. What were those conversations like?
We were criticized by some people in the community for not explicitly backing cash reparations to survivors. But that was not part of our mission. So our view on that was that's certainly something that could be looked at. And we're good with somebody else looking at it, but that's not what we're doing.
Right.
We're doing something different from that. So we're focusing on education, so working with the curriculum in the public schools at the local and state level. We're focused on building a museum, and we're focused on enhancing cultural and heritage tourism to boost the traffic in the community to the economic advantage of the entrepreneurs that exist and future entrepreneurs that might want to locate there.
I think that's really interesting and an interesting distinction. And I recall the conversation around that, right, and around the commission and critiques even of it. So your most recent book, I think this moves naturally from where we're headed right now. In your most recent book, 100 Ways We Can Advance Social Justice Without Destroying One Another.
10.
It's 10 ways. 10 ways. I'm sorry. Yeah. Well, 100 even would be good too. That'd be good. Sorry about that. Seems to unite your historical training with your expertise in diversity work, with part of your broader portfolio. What drove you to write that book? And was it your personal experiences, our current moment, a combination of both?
It's all that stuff. I mean, I see a lot of people who are almost catatonic around these various social justice issues because some of the issues seem so gargantuan that people are just lulled into a kind of a stupor around them. They don't feel like they can make any meaningful impact. So the point of the book is to give people a primer on ways that you can engage around the issues that are important to you. So it's not about partisanship. It really is about picking what's important to you and thinking about ways that you can use your agency to do something constructive with regard to that issue.
So was it driven by observations around large public gatherings and movements, Black Lives Matter, and a variety of other things? Was it sort of did that drive some of your thinking and about where to go or offering practical ideas?
I think the thinking for that book is really animated by my personal experience because I've been involved in a lot of organizations around a whole lot of issues, observed various processes that worked and some that didn't work, and really thought about what issues are most important to me and how I could engage around them. So it's really a sharing of information gleaned through experience, research as well.
So what are some of the 10?
So they're not listed in any particular order, but just a couple of them. The first one I think I listed is speak truth. And so that's so important because we're bombarded with information. And in order to speak truth, you must have truth. And in order to glean truth, you must evaluate, vet information, think critically. All those things are important to do before you speak your truth,
right?
Before you even know what your truth is.
Right.
So that's one of them. Another one is what I label as play politics, but it doesn't have anything to do with partisanship. It has to do with understanding that political actors, like elected officials, have a great deal to say about the issues that matter to us. So it's not enough for you to sit on the sideline. You need to engage with those political actors. That might mean making a phone call, sending an email, attending a meeting, running for a school board. But it's about understanding that getting engaged with the political system has a great deal to say about the issues that likely matter to you, whatever the issue might be.
Yeah. I think that's a great point. Really great point, in fact. So are you optimistic that we can bridge deep divisions? And maybe secondarily, are these divisions really as wide and deep as we might presume?
Dr. Martin Luther King said, we must accept finite disappointment, but we must never lose infinite hope. So I am optimistic. I also think I'm realistic too. So I'm not a Pollyanna, but I don't think I have a choice but to be optimistic. How could I get up every day if I weren't optimistic? I have to believe that it's possible that things could be better than they are now.
Mm-hmm.
And I have to understand that, just alluding to something you said earlier, sometimes it's one step forward, two steps back, unfortunately.
Right.
But it is my hope that there are enough people in this community and in this world who want the best for everyone, that that we can sort of move forward together. That's my hope, and that's why I'm optimist.
It's what we have before us. It's what we have to work with, right? That's, I think, a really important point. So what's next for you? What are you working on now?
I'm working on a chapter for a book with some academics, and it's a book about reconciliation, which is perfect because it's something I've thought about. So my chapter really has to do with the situation in Tulsa, particularly the massacre and that history, and how the Tulsa community has worked toward reconciliation. And it sort of forced me to think about and catalog the various things that we've done, while once again simultaneously acknowledging that there's a whole lot more that we can do. But I think to do that additional piece, it's really critical that we pause and reflect on what we've been able to do.
Right. It's part of the history work, right? That's an element of this. So I've got a couple of questions to wrap things up, and these are questions that we ask all of our guests because they kind of cut to the core of the point for this podcast. So these days, here in the 21st century, history and humanities are struggling to demonstrate our relevance to college students and I suppose the public. We're told that focusing on history is a bad career move, among other perceived deficiencies. At the same time, Americans consume history enthusiastically. We buy books, we watch documentaries, we enjoy Hollywood films based in historical periods of time, and we appeal to history all the time. Think of debates and discussions of contemporary issues where ultimately, inevitably, the phrase, well, history tells us the following, is injected in the conversation with some force. So how do you think about that? Sort of thinking about this apparent paradox between history struggling for oxygen inside the academy, inside universities, and its popularity outside the walls of the academy.
Well, colleges and universities have to really reflect on their mission and the balance between, are we preparing people for the workforce, or are we preparing people for citizenship?
Mm-hmm.
Are we doing both? What's the appropriate mix? That is an ongoing, I think, struggle, that sort of mission struggle within the college and university community. We talked earlier about the fact that history as taught in the primary and secondary school systems is sanitized. It's in some, when I took history, I would use the word pablum. It was really pretty bad. And so I think once people become adults, there's a thirst for real, compelling history, which, as we alluded to earlier, is much more interesting than the stuff that we get, the sanitized version. So it doesn't surprise me that there's clamoring for this information in adulthood, but universities and colleges struggle with the sort of marketing aspects of history as preparation for particular slots in the workforce.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a real challenge. That's well put. And it is the struggle in the university that's driven by a number of things, including the cost of higher education and things of that sort. But, right, the conversation about preparation for citizenship, which is also a very old idea surrounding the university. John Dewey and other people, right, wrote eloquently about it, that tension is there, and universities, I think, are struggling with it. So I got one last question for you. And we call this the party question. And the party question kind of goes like this. When you're at gatherings of one sort or another, I'm sure you field history questions or questions about history, particularly when people know you or find out what you do. If you had to decide, what would be the question you wish somebody asked you?
I most often get asked, of course, about Black Wall Street and the history surrounding the massacre. So I think I would want to be asked, how can I leverage the Black Wall Street history to create a 21st century community that reflects a shared humanity in which an event such as a massacre would never occur?
I love that. That's a great one. It'd be nice if someone asked that, right? Yeah, that's a fantastic answer. Well, anyway, thank you for exploring good history with us, Hannibal. On behalf of the Good History team, my colleague, Dr. Sarah Griswold, who's the creative force behind this podcast, Christina Rogers, a newly minted PhD from our department who manages episode research and preparation, and Jesse Ulrich, Chief Executive of Rant 9 Productions, who is the Good History producer and a trained historian, which kind of makes our point about good history and the various ways history informs our lives. Thank you to all of them. And remember, for everybody listening, the only bad history is the history we don't know. So thank you.
Thank you.